At the beginning of the 20th century, the world was living through what was known as the Golden Age of polar exploration, as major nations raced to reach the coldest places on Earth. Britain had legendary explorers like Scott and Shackleton, while Norway won the southern race through Roald Amundsen. Amid this excitement, Canada decided to join the competition and leave its mark in history. Here emerges Vilhjalmur Stefansson, an ambitious anthropologist of Canadian origin and American nationality, known for his remarkable power of persuasion. He proposed to the Canadian government a grand scientific expedition to the Arctic, promising that its discoveries would spark a scientific revolution and perhaps even lead to the discovery of new lands or an entire continent rich in natural resources. Impressed by his passion and confidence, the government agreed to fund the project, later known as the Canadian Arctic Expedition. The expedition was divided into two teams, an exploratory team led by Stefansson to search for new lands and map the seafloor, and a scientific team led by zoologist Rudolf Anderson to document the region's geography, resources, and the lives of its native people in the Mackenzie Delta. The expedition needed a strong ship capable of withstanding the harsh conditions of the Arctic, so they chose the Karluk, an old whaling vessel about 29 years old. Although her wooden hull was reinforced to endure the ice, she was not a true icebreaker. Her ordinary design and weak engine, less than 200 horsepower, made her unsuitable for such a mission. But Stefansson ignored those warnings, dismissing them as unimportant details. Captain Robert Bartlett, on the other hand, was his complete opposite, a legendary sailor from Newfoundland, with long experience in frozen seas, and fully aware that any mistake on such a journey could cost lives. From the very first day, he noticed that the crew had been chosen carelessly and that many of them were unqualified. He tried to correct a few issues by replacing the first officer and requesting that the supplies be inspected, but Stefansson refused, claiming there was no time. And so, in June 1913, the Karluk set sail from the port of Esquimalt in British Columbia, carrying 25 men, sailors and scientists, along with 2 Inuit, Eskimo families who joined the expedition to help with hunting and survival in the deadly Arctic cold. At the beginning of the journey, morale was high. Everyone dreamed of glory and of raising Canada's flag on new land. But soon, tension arose between Stefansson's eagerness to push forward and reach before anyone else, and Captain Bartlett's caution, who believed they were already late in the season and that the ship wasn't fit to face the ice. Despite Bartlett's objections, Stefansson's voice was stronger, backed by the government, and so the ship continued north of Alaska through the Chukchi Sea. As they advanced, chunks of ice began appearing first as small pieces, then thicker and wider until they completely surrounded the ship. The crew tried desperately to break the ice around them, but it was useless. The Karluk became trapped, frozen solid in the ice, drifting helplessly westward, the opposite of their intended direction, moving farther from land every day. The early excitement faded, replaced by anxiety and fear, while Stefansson kept reassuring everyone that the ice would melt soon. But Bartlett, with his experience, realized the horrifying truth. The ship would never break free. Their scientific mission had turned into a fight for survival. The crew remained trapped in the ice for an entire month without moving an inch, until in September, Stefansson decided to go out with a small group on a short hunting trip to bring back fresh meat instead of the dried one. But Captain Bartlett was suspicious. Stefansson himself had previously said that caribou had disappeared from northern Alaska, so why was he going there now? Despite Bartlett's warnings about the moving ice, Stefansson insisted on leaving. He took the best sled dogs and an excessive amount of supplies, far more than a short trip would need, and headed toward the mainland. He never came back. A few days later, a massive snowstorm struck the area, causing the ice floe surrounding the ship to shift violently, dragging it at speeds of up to 50 kilometers a day, sometimes even 100. At that point, Captain Bartlett took full command. He divided the men into hunting teams to gather seal and polar bear meat, used their skins for warmth, carefully rationed the food, coal, and oil, and ordered daily exercises to maintain fitness and blood circulation. As the long polar winter set in, the sun disappeared completely, and temperatures dropped to 50 degrees below zero. Breathing itself became painful, and even blankets froze stiff on their bodies. Life aboard the Karluk turned into a frozen nightmare of hunger and despair. Supplies were running dangerously low, and meals dwindled to dry biscuits, canned meat, and the occasional rare seal. Hopelessness crept into their hearts, and many began to believe that death was now inevitable. Despite Bartlett's attempts to lift their spirits with stories of past expeditions that had survived similar conditions, the end drew near. The ship started to tilt and groan under the crushing pressure of the ice, leaning dangerously as if warning them of the catastrophe to come. On the morning of the 11th of January 1914, the crew awoke to a deafening crack. Captain Bartlett rushed to the deck and saw sharp shards of ice piercing through the ship's hull, seawater flooding in and freezing the moment it touched the air. Bartlett ordered the men to throw overboard anything they could to lighten the load, but the ice was merciless. By evening, the Karluk's hull gave way, and the ship sank completely beneath the ice, leaving the crew stranded atop a drifting ice floe in the middle of the frozen Arctic Ocean, more than 320 kilometers from the nearest land. Now there was no Stephenson, no ship, only a few supplies salvaged from the wreck, and an endless white desert beneath their feet, cracking and shifting without warning. Bartlett immediately took charge of the crisis. They set up tents, gathered what food they could, and organized hunting duties. 2 Inuit families proved crucial to their survival. They taught the men how to build igloos and use animal fat as fuel for heating and cooking. Thanks to them, their new base, which they called Shipwreck Camp, managed to endure. But discipline couldn't prevent division. On the 21st of January 1914, 4 men led by First Officer Anderson decided to leave the camp and try reaching Wrangel Island on their own. After they departed, they vanished forever. Then, on February 5, a second group, including 2 prominent scientists, also rebelled against Bartlett's orders. They left behind a note releasing him of responsibility for their fate. They set off into the storm. A few days later, they were spotted in terrible condition, but refused to return and soon disappeared without a trace. As for Bartlett and the remaining survivors, they knew time was running out, and their only hope now was to reach Wrangel Island at any cost. On the 19th of February 1914, Captain Bartlett decided the time had come for one final attempt. After preparing the supplies and dividing the men into 4 teams, they set out on a terrifying journey across a frozen ocean filled with cracks and broken ice blocks that could swallow them at any moment. For days, they marched across the ice until they faced massive ice ridges 30 meters high, towering like frozen mountains blocking their way. They had no choice but to carve a path through the ice with their bare hands, despite their weakness and gnawing hunger. It took them an entire week to move only 5 kilometers, but they pressed on with unbelievable determination. Then, on March 12, after weeks of struggle, they spotted a thin line of sand on the horizon Wrangel Island. Their joy exploded, but it didn't last. The island was barren and frozen, without a single tree or source of warmth, only a few pieces of driftwood thrown ashore by the waves. They were forced to sleep in tattered tents amid the deadly cold, while hunting grew scarce and their supplies ran thin. Bartlett realized they had fallen into a new trap. The island lay far from any navigational route, and no rescue ship would ever find them. The only hope was for someone to go and seek help, a journey of more than 1,100 kilometers across the frozen sea and the Siberian wilderness. And there was only one man capable of it, Bartlett himself. He chose his companion, Karluk, one of the most skilled Inuit hunters, and on the 18th of March 1914, he bid farewell to his men and set off on a desperate journey into the unknown. The 2 men faced torment beyond description, walking over cracked ice, battered by fierce winds, in temperatures that dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Their clothes were torn by the cold, and Bartlett's boots broke apart, forcing him to wrap his foot in cloth and limp forward, while they slept inside small ice shelters or directly under a piece of fabric. Death passed by them more than once, but their determination was stronger. After weeks of hell, they finally reached the Siberian coast on April 4. Bartlett had made it to Siberia, but the arrival wasn't the end of his suffering. The first villages he encountered were inhabited by the Chukchi people, who viewed strangers as a threat. The presence of Karluk and Inuit made things worse, as there was an old feud between the 2 groups. But Bartlett used his skill in negotiation, trading what little supplies he had left and promising them a greater reward if they helped him reach safety. After weeks of marching through cold and hunger, he reached a Russian settlement called Ematun. There, he met Baron Kleist, who helped him send a telegraph of distress to Canada and the United States. Meanwhile, on Wrangel Island, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. The supplies were running out, hunting had nearly stopped, and the men were becoming dangerously weak. Tensions rose, and distrust spread among the group. Then, one night, they heard a gunshot. When they rushed into the tent, they found one of the men dead, a bullet in his head. The gun was lying in an odd position, raising suspicions that it wasn't suicide, but there was no clear proof. After the incident, fear took over everyone. Illness began to spread, swelling in the legs, extreme weakness, and total exhaustion. Everyone was trying to survive, but the conditions were far stronger than they were. At first, the men thought the strange illness spreading among them was scurvy, the sailor's disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. But strangely, they were eating fresh seal meat, which usually prevents that illness. When they started dying one after another, the real cause became clear: severe poisoning from the dried pemmican, the food supplies that Stephenson had insisted on taking without testing before the expedition. The method of preserving it had been wrong, and instead of being a source of life, it became a slow poison that killed them, one by one. The situation was tragic. Some of the men died inside their tents, while the rest were too weak to even bury them. They ended up sleeping beside the corpses of their comrades, waiting for their own turn. Their only hope was that Captain Bartlett would appear at any moment with a rescue ship. And in truth, Bartlett didn't disappoint them. Despite his injuries from the brutal journey, he refused treatment or returning home until he made sure his distress message had been delivered. With the help of Baron Kleist, the message was finally sent through Russia, Canada, and the United States. But the world was on the verge of World War I, and polar expeditions were the last thing anyone cared about. Despite all the difficulties, Bartlett stayed in Siberia, pushing and fighting to make the rescue mission happen. By the end of May, he finally reached Alaska after a grueling sea voyage, where he contacted both Canadian and American authorities. He requested a specific ship, one he was sure was the only vessel capable of the mission, the U.S. Coast Guard ship the Bear. And in June 1914, the ship set sail with the rescue team and Bartlett himself heading toward Wrangel Island. But the path to salvation was anything but easy. The weather was brutal, and thick ice blocked their way across the sea. On August 25th, only 32 kilometers from the island, the ship froze solid in a massive wall of ice. The captain had no choice but to turn back for more coal, while Bartlett watched his dream of rescue slip farther away. In the city of Nome, Bartlett accidentally met Captain Olaf Swenson, who had chartered a ship called the King and Winge. Bartlett begged him to try reaching Wrangel Island himself, and after much pleading, Swenson finally agreed. On September 7th, 1914, the King and Winge finally reached the island. The rescuers stepped ashore to witness one of the most horrifying scenes in the history of polar expeditions. Out of 25 people, only 11 were still alive. Their faces were pale, their bodies frail, and their eyes hollow from exhaustion and hunger. And when they saw Bartlett, they broke down in tears. They hugged him one by one, thanking the man who never abandoned them for a single moment. Karluk, the Inuit hunter who had accompanied Bartlett on that impossible journey, stood silently beside him alive, after facing death hundreds of times. After their return, every survivor wrote his own memoir, recounting the nightmare they had endured. As for Vilhjalmur Stephenson, the mastermind and the one most responsible, he gained the reputation of a traitor among the survivors, but defended himself, claiming his departure was essential for the success of the expedition's goals. Ironically, his public reputation remained largely untarnished, while the name of the true hero, Captain Bartlett, was quietly forgotten. Just 1 year later, another polar expedition captured the world's attention, and the tragedy of the Karluk was buried in the forgotten pages of history. As for the two groups that disappeared at the beginning of the disaster, their fate remained unknown until 1924, when the crew of an American ship discovered human remains on Herald Island, which were later confirmed to belong to Anderson's group. The second group, however, was never found, and thus ended the story of the Karluk Expedition, a journey that began as a scientific dream and ended as a human tragedy frozen in the heart of the Arctic.